Okay, this video is thoughts on learning and study skills. Really, it's on how to become a great student. And, I'm coming from not getting a B plus in a high school class. I'm talking about how to graduate first in your class in medical school, how to get 99% board scores in your residency. Really the top level. I was a great student at Stanford, first in my medical school class, etc. I don't want to bore you with that. Okay, so anyways, first of all, let's talk about how you approach a lecture. A lecture is an emotional event. If the class is recorded, you can then watch it later. And the nice thing about a recording, you can play it back. You can go over the difficult parts multiple times. That's great. But in a lot of places, you only get one lecture and you have to absorb as much as possible from that. And a good thing to do is to make it an emotional event. I would get overwhelmed in my biochemistry lectures. Then I knew this guy who had graduated first in his class, who was a year ahead of me. And I asked him, how did you do it? And he says, you get the old last year's cooperative notes, they were called in my med school, and you read those the night before the lecture for any of your difficult classes. And I started to do that. I would spend a lot of time, hours reading, let's say, about a biochemistry topic, cycloglycolysis, for example. I put the pictures out on my table, and I'd try to understand it as well as I could on my own the night before. And that pre-reading gets you in there. Everybody's smarter the second time they've seen the material. And the next thing, too, to make it an emotional event and to minimize distractions, like the Michael Merzenich quote, how do you improve brain function? You train the brain to do whatever you want it to do, to learn the biochemistry, and then you minimize distractions. So you sit right in the front row. I used to say to myself, I'm like a goalie, and the PhD professor is trying to get something past me, and I'm going to try to not let him get anything past me. And I would be psyched up for it, Biochemistry is the language of God, and if I'm going to become a great doctor and a great scientist, I have to learn the language of God to create life. And so I was really sort of enthusiastic about biochemistry. It's the most difficult class in medical school, and it was also my favorite class, and that helped me to learn it well. Okay, and also it got me psyched up. I'd even talk to myself, So I was a little intimidated by the professor, and so I was real happy that I went from only understanding about 10-15% of it to, by the time I had done this, I would get most of it. At least 80, 85%, 90% from the lecture, because I was so well prepared going in. You know all the vocabulary, you know all the abbreviations, you can take notes well. So getting psyched up for class is a big deal, and you must sit in the front row. I did that all through my career, through residency too. My residency, I was the only resident in the entire program, first year resident to sit in the front row. I was the only resident to take notes. I was done with my 4.5 hour test in about an hour and 10 minutes with a perfect score on my diagnostic radiology residency boards, which is really the top 10 or 15% of the class academically. So that was progress. Okay, anyways, let's see what else. Get yourself, motivated to learn that information. Think how that information will help you. And the reason you want to do that is because your brain's programmed to remember what you care about, what's important to you. So if you've convinced yourself that this subject is important to you, your brain's much more likely to remember it. You can look at the memory contestants and what they do. The main thing they do is they wear ear protectors, which is to decrease distractions, reduce noise. You want to have a quiet place to study. School, really, the way it's handled in America for most topics, it's basically a memorization contest. So you want to get good at memorization. Now, the memory champions are great at memorization, but they tend to memorize stuff like a deck of cards or, how many digits, the 100th digit in pi or something. Relatively random information to which they add something. You can use a memory palace, letter, number, alphabet, or some other formula, the path you walk on the way home from school or something. And what I'm trying to say is that's not the kind of stuff a student needs to memorize. A student needs to memorize, for some subjects like learning a language, it's binary, the vocabulary words of Spanish or French or something. But for other subjects, you're trying to memorize something where there's a bunch of categories and hierarchies, and you're trying to put it all together. How do all these things interact, like the physiology of an individual cell? So you need to know the plasma membrane, and then the organelles have a similar membranes, okay? And then how do they all work together? Why does the mitochondria have a double membrane? So what I'm saying is you're not just trying to remember the information for a couple minutes to, try to win the contest. You're trying to remember this at least until your semester final exam is over, or your board's exam at the end of 2 years or 3 years, or also you might want to know this the rest of your life if it's really important to you. When you learn how to drive a car, you remember that the rest of your life. So that's up to you to decide, but definitely ask yourself, am I going to remember this as long as I need to know it? So Where does it fit into the categories? Where does it fit into the hierarchy? What's a word association, a rhyme, a joke, or anything, a visual metaphor that you can think of? Because you want to be sure I've done something to lock this in long term. That doesn't happen by accident. So you have to make a conscious effort to lock things in long term. And if you do that, though, you will lock them in long term. I used to make mnemonics like when I was a radiology resident that because I would rotate, let's say I rotate through neuroradiology. I might not rotate through it again for another 6 months or a year. So I wanted the stuff to come back to me really fast. And we'll talk about some ways you can do that. But like we're saying here, when you study a subject that already has its own hierarchies and categories and structure and the connections, you're just trying to discover them, okay? And another big thing that's useful pretty much in most domains is to understand what causes what. What is the cause of this and this and that, and try to follow them in order. What is the normal sequence of events? So all of that, you're trying to memorize the story, if you will. Have a good conversation friend or study friend. I had some friends when I was like a radiology resident, and mostly they were younger than me. And I would study with them, and I was mostly their teacher, but that was good for me to teach them. And try to find real smart people to hang around. Try to have at least one friend who's smart that you could really talk to. A lot of people don't have any smart friends they can talk to. So try to have at least one. And a lot of other people, they're busy. They don't want to talk to you because they're busy. So just at least try to find somebody with similar interests to you that you can share information with, because that's real valuable. Like whenever I see a really good case, I have some doctor friends who I like talking to. I'll look at the case, I'll look up something on the computer, I'll recognize an insight into understanding the disease, and I'll call one of my friends up and discuss it with them, because I know from experience it's good for them to hear about the case or see the case, but it's very valuable for me to have a conversation about it, because I know that if I have that conversation, I'll tend to remember the case much better, a month from now, 6 months, a year from now, 6 years from now. Okay, a lot of times too, I'll develop a theory about what's causing a disease, what's causing a patient's problem or something, and I'll run that theory by one of my doctor buddies, and then I'll let them pick apart my theory. What do you think of that rationale? And see what they think, and if they find a flaw in my reasoning, that's good. I learn from that, and you'll try to restructure it or make it better. Nowadays too, like if I read a book, to remember the book, I'll make a book review about it. Then when I want to remember that book again, I can just watch the video review. What I also do is when I read a book is I write all this information in the back inside cover, and I actually index the key points in the book sometimes, depending on how good I think the book is, so I can go back to it real quick. I also put highlights on it, post-its, dog-ear the pages. Analyze mistakes. If you make a mistake or a friend makes a mistake, analyze, why did this happen? What can we do different? And you'll learn from that. How you view an image. Like I look at the flare sequence of the brain. I always look at it twice. First, I look for the deep white matter periventricular flare hyperintensity. Second time I go around looking at the convexities, looking for subarachnoid blood, subdural blood. I see that get missed if you don't do that. Try to engage in the subject in the real world. For example, if you want to be a good wrestler, you can't just practice technique. You need to scrimmage, and you need to be in a competition ideally. Then you'll get a lot better at it. Using the skill in real life. Like when I was in biology, luckily I had this friend who was more advanced than I was in biology at that time, and he took me, we went bird watching. He had an old naturalist friend who was a published professor of biology and bird watching, and so we would go through all this stuff and talk about it on our nature walks while we're bird watching, and we talk about zoology, biology books we were reading, and that was helpful. Imagine that you're going to do that subject for a career, and how would it help you in whatever else you want to do? And I talked before too about the book Sorrow is a Young Werther by Goethe, where this guy was in love with this girl Charlotte, and Werther was in love with Charlotte, and Werther had a friend named Wilhelm. There were no cell phones in that day. He would just write letters to his friend, how much he loves Charlotte, the way she walks, the way she talks, the way she interacts with her siblings, etc. And the point I'm saying is try to fall in love with biology in that way. If you're in love with biology the way he's in love with Charlotte, you're going to become great at it. Goethe had said, for a man to really learn a complex subject, he must love it, because that enthusiasm pushes you through the long hours, the plateau, the tedium that you have to go through as part of becoming an expert in something. And if you really are interested in something, it's fun to become an expert, because an expert's when you have more fun. Then you can think uniquely, originally about it, and be creative in the field. And the reason I'm going through all this psychology stuff here is because I think that's a major dividing point between how people do, because I knew people, let's say at Stanford and other places, who had, I think, very high IQs, but they weren't motivated. Like I knew this one guy, he was really bright at Stanford. He'd gone to the East Coast prep schools, but he wasn't motivated. He started smoking marijuana, and he just did crappy. I don't even know if he dropped out of school. And I knew this other guy who was not that bright. You know, he's a little bit slow almost. It kind of came out of him when you talked to him. But he wanted to join his father to be a lawyer in Florida. So he was so motivated to someday make it and be a success and work with his dad that he studied like all day long, day after day after day. And he did fine, okay? But I wouldn't call him a bright guy by any stretch of the means. And he said something funny one time. He had been drinking, and he said, I don't even know why I'm at this place, Stanford. He goes, I don't belong here. I'm a dumb MF mofo. And he said, but, someday I'm going to join my daddy. And he just worked his butt off, and he was successful. So his motivation pulled him through. A guy, I don't know what his IQ is. It was lower than average, significantly for the average Stanford student, and he was successful, decent student. And then the other guy who sort of like had a genius level IQ, but he wasn't motivated at all, he just sort of became dissipated and lost. And I actually think my IQ is not necessarily that high. I don't know what it is for sure, but I think I had a very smart personality in terms of wanting to learn, being super motivated, and I, over time, developed great study skills. And that combination of being motivated, having good study skills, knowing how to learn, I just started accumulating a lot of knowledge. And if you accumulate a lot of knowledge, average person is not really improving much. Let's say average doctor, but I just kept going and going and getting more knowledgeable. So I developed way more knowledge than average doctors now with time, just because of that. And people say, "Oh, you're so smart." Pfft, I wasn't even an honor student in high school. Okay, attitude, things that matter. Growth mindset by Carol Dweck. That's the idea that if you put effort into it, you can improve. And it's better that a kid thinks that way, so they make the effort. Versus if a person thinks that knowledge is fixed, they're not going to make much progress. Like I sometimes tutor students or friends, family, parents. They'll send kids to have me talk to kids to help them get their act together in school, for example. So I'm talking to this one college student. I'm telling him, well, these are the things you should do to improve your academics. He goes, that's not true. I go, what do you mean that's not true? He says, I know some kids, and they're just really smart, and they get A's in high school and college, and they don't do all this stuff. And I said, well, first of all, a lot of people sort of pretend that they're not really trying hard, and they are when you're not looking. Okay, they call that the paddling duck syndrome over at Stanford. That people try to act all cool, calm, and collected when they're around others, but when they're by themselves, they're working their tails off. And I think that tends to be true. Plus, I'm like, gosh, I know what works. Okay, I've been in the middle of intense academics for many, many years, so I know what works and I know what doesn't. Okay, and you might as well do the best you can with what you got. You have to start with your baseline IQ wherever it is, and having a smart personality and good study skills, that's worth at least about 40 IQ points, which is it's a lot, okay? So you might as well take advantage of it. Okay, if you get yourself motivated, then studying becomes more enjoyable, and if it's more enjoyable, you'll study more and you'll do better. They all kind of work together. Like I had a friend who was in law school, and I remember talking to him one time when I was in med school, and he said, oh man, this last Saturday was a bitch. He studied so much. He studied for 5 hours. And I just laughed at him. I'm like, I could study easily 10 hours on a weekend if I had nothing else going on and I wanted to learn something. I'd study 5 hours on a school night. That's nothing. Any medical student would laugh at somebody saying they studied 5 hours and thought that was a lot. But I know why, because he didn't really like being in law school, and it was painful for him to study a lot. Versus if you like what you're doing, 5 hours is nothing. You're just getting warmed up. You wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning. 5 hours, it's 11 o'clock. And I'll take a couple breaks in there, make it noon, including breaks and stuff, by the time you got 5 hours in. But that's pretty easy to do. It's good to have some type of big goal, whatever that might be. Your goal might be just you want to get more educated. You want to write better. You want to think better. That's fine. Most young people don't really think that way, though. You could have the desire to become educated, to be a modern Renaissance man, to excel, to get a degree. And that's reasonable, too. I've seen people who weren't that bright, but they were poor growing up, and they just wanted to be financially successful, and that motivated them tremendously, and they did well enough, okay? But you'll never be great if that's just your goal, is just to make money. You can get good at making money, but you'll never have a creative aesthetic sense, be able to create anything beautiful. To eventually get a good job, to know how to save people, you want to be able to help people, and just, wanting to make money. That's a big motivator, okay? And, to get that degree sometimes is a stepping stone, a guild barrier to a lot of careers. like medicine, law, the so-called professions. One thing I kind of screwed up in a sense was I grew up in kind of a wealthy family. My father made a lot of money as a doctor, and I just assumed I'm smarter than my dad. I'll be wealthy. I never really thought about it. And so I would have been wise to have learned more about finances at a young age. I should have. I didn't. A great book to read is that Rich Dad Poor Dad by Kiyosaki. It's good to have an attitude, why not me? When I was on the cross-country running team my senior year of high school, these other guys had scored a lot higher on the SAT than me. And, I said, well, why not me? Because I played Monopoly with them, Stratego Risk and stuff. And I'm like, gosh, there's not any big difference between their intellect and mine. Why can't I score really high in the SAT test? So I studied on my own, took it over 3 times, and I did way, way, way better. Okay. And so I would say to myself, well, why can't I, get an A? Why can't I get an A plus? Why can't I be the best student in the class? Why can't I be the best student in the USA in the subject? So what I'm trying to say is when you start thinking that way, and that's why it's good to be around other kids that are really good students, you think that way, and then it becomes more natural to do better. And if you just aspire to that, you'll do a lot better. You can kind of predict a person's college academic performance by their high school grades, their IQ, their SAT score, their ACT score, motivation level, their study skills, and if they're a conscientious worker. I like cross country because the same determination to run your best for 3 miles is like what it takes to study through a long, difficult subject. SAT and ACT score, you can tremendously increase your ability by preparing for those tests. All I did was buy the little practice book and do them on my own. And then whenever I found a weakness like in math or something, I would review it till I knew it. And there was no computer back in those days. There was no internet back in those days when I was a young whippersnapper. Let's see. So all of that I think makes a difference. And a lot of it's that determination. I would finish whatever I had to study. It was a big deal to me. And because of that, I had that motivation. It would push me through because there's always some mood ups and downs, successes and failures, happiness, disappointments. That's all part of it all. Condensed notes. It's good to help you organize the material. One sec here. Oh, I got one of my condensed notes books here. Wasn't planning on even showing these books in this lecture, but I'll just show them to you. Here's my radiology residency boards book, okay? And, this is one where I just kept my mnemonics, I think. Or is this the big one? Yeah, here it is. And you can see I just filled up all the pages. It's an outline format, so you can find everything quick. Here, I'll make it a little bit bigger for you. Like I said, I had like a perfect score, and I was done in a third of the time. So I put tons of notes in the margins. You can see all these page number things here that, I'm trying to get it here. I would cross-reference the book with these page numbers on here, like where my thumb is, so I could find everything super fast. Because everybody runs into crunch time the last couple weeks before the test. I'd highlight it with different colors, color-coded highlighting, if you will. And everything is an outline format. I like these outline format books for making my condensed notes. So condensed notes means everything is there. Like I said, too, here's the index in the back of the book. You want that index so you can find everything. So I was able to find everything real quick. I actually own 3 copies of this book. One I would bring with me to conference, and I'd sit right in the front row. And then I had one at home that I studied with. And then I had another one that I would just, that I used to put mnemonics into. I made hundreds and hundreds of mnemonics from memorizing this stuff. Show you one more book. This was what I called my my illustrated condensed notes. I just took an ear, nose, and throat book, and I would tape all the pictures of ear, nose, and throat, head and neck, anatomy in here, because this is when I was taking my neuroradiology boards. And ENT is like one of the harder things in neuroradiology. And so I learned it all with this. And I was told by one of the instructors that I had gotten a perfect score. That's unofficial, though, because it was an oral exam, but I was told by... Well, actually, they told my department chief of my of my fellowship program that I had gotten a perfect score. You see, I tabbed all the indices, again, so I could find everything real fast, because that's kind of what you want, is to be able to find stuff fast. Nowadays, you got the internet, but I always liked having a book. You can bring a book anywhere you go in your house, to the library, in the bathroom, whatever you want. I think books are kind of underrated. The modern world acts like it doesn't need books, but I like having them. Okay, condensed notes, it gets you to organize the material. You're interacting with it. It's active studying as you're deciding what to include, what not to include, where to put it in the book, should you cross-reference it, what else you need to do. The Feynman method is to just write down everything you know about a subject and gradually organize it over time, and that can be a good way to learn stuff. I use that for learning a lot of things in the real world, but for the academic world, it's more structured. You know what you need to know. There's sort of a standardized content for neuroradiology of the brain, neuroradiology of the head and neck, neuroradiology of the spine, etc. Radiology of the heart, of the lungs, of the abdomen, of the pelvis, of the musculoskeletal system. All right, so that's mostly like a memorization thing of known information versus later on when you start getting into new wide open territories, there's a lot of new stuff coming in from all directions, and that takes a little more creative effort. But from a student's point of view in school, most of what they're studying is standardized information. It's good to do walk and talk. Self-test is what I would usually call it. Other people call it free recall. And you can do this in many ways. You can sit down and write everything out. That's a good way to do it. Call it a written self-test. You can walk and talk to yourself every time you take a study break, when you go to the bathroom, when you go to do your laundry, when you go to eat lunch, okay? And when you're driving in your car, sit there talking to yourself. Okay, in glycolysis, the first step is glucose is brought into the cell and it's phosphorylated by hexokinase, and that puts a charge on it so it can't go back out, exit out the plasma membrane, etc. And you just talk to yourself, and then you get really confident because I knew I could produce all the information for a class. I could say everything. I was conversant in it. So when I would take a test, I wasn't worried about recognizing everything. I could produce everything. And so I never did an all-nighter. I would sleep just fine the night before, and I'd be real confident going into the test because I knew the material and I could talk about it. And in the real world, if somebody asks me, what do you think of this patient? I have to discuss with them the findings, the clinical situation. The real life isn't a Scantron test. Real life is communicating about things. Okay, what else? Anything where you're actively interacting with the material, like with condensed notes or walk and talk self-tests, that tends to produce better long-term retention, and it helps you to understand the complexity of the information. What is the hierarchy? What are the categories? What causes what? How does it all fit together? And all those things improve long-term memory. And the mnemonics and stuff too would help me to call up things that are less common to remember them. You can make a mind map. You can write an outline. Whatever strikes your mood and you think is going to help you, just do it. The benefit here is by knowing all the different techniques, you can pick the one that's going to work best for you at that given moment and situation. Flashcards. I didn't start using flashcards till later in my career, but I've seen some people have really good results with them. I knew a guy who got 99% on his residency boards exam by using flashcards. He had a whole big picnic table in his apartment, and he had different boxes for all the subsections of his field in there, so that's pretty good. It's good to have a space interval repetition system to get you to spend more time with the difficult topics, less time with the easy stuff you already know. I've given other previous talks like how to raise IQ and become a genius, where I showed you the pictures of the Lightner boxes for space interval repetition systems on your own. They're like shoe boxes, really. And Anki, ANKI on the internet is a good online site for flashcards. You could try that. I'm sure there's other ones. Again, I did those, I think, like my second time around when I had to repeat my boards. You have to repeat it every 10 years, so I had to repeat it. And I found them helpful that time around. So they're good for like stimulus response, question answer, quick brief things like learning vocabulary in L2, a second language, Spanish, Italian, French, whatever you want to study. Good to keep it short and brief. That's more memorable, the question and the answer. Okay, well, this motivation is a big stuff. I think that's one of the big things that separates, the top-notch students from the ones who are just adequate or good. And so why not get that on your side, okay? And if you're not that enthusiastic, for your field or for something in it, then, maybe you're in the wrong field, okay? Get that figured out as well. I knew some people, all they really cared about was money. And so if they care about money, they can get themselves, I've seen through med school, for example, pretty well. But they never do anything beyond that. Their goal was simply like, I knew this one girl. She's real nice, but I mean, she said, I'm not that good at business. I don't have that outgoing personality. I couldn't make much money in anything else, but I know in medicine, all you have to do is take a test and get a grade, and then you end up making a lot of money. So she goes, so that's why I decided to do medicine. She didn't care about medicine itself. She just wanted to make money, she said, and live in a nice neighborhood and have a nice house. And so that's what she did. And she was actually really smart. She graduated like way up near the top of her class, but she didn't have any motivation beyond that. So somebody like that, they might successfully complete everything, be totally competent, just fine in conventional medical practice for what they do, but they're never going to do any creative intellectual work. They're never going to, write an insightful paper, make a unique lecture or anything, because that's irrelevant to them. They have already accomplished their goal, was becoming competent in their field so they can make a reliable income for the rest of their career. And don't get me wrong, they can function well in a conventional setting. But, again, I was always interested in this sort of philosophic thing. I wanted to achieve more than my father did. I wanted to become great in medicine and science to sort of make up for having gotten injured and ruined my wrestling career. So all that aesthetic stuff, one could laugh at it if they want, but I know that was a secret of how I would just do so great academically, and later on was able to write all these books and stuff because I had all this drive, this energy, and I enjoyed all this stuff. I mean, I made plenty of mistakes in my life, mostly from a social point of view, a little bit from a financial point of view. From an academic style, I was great. Like I said, books are great. You can carry them anywhere. Look at my Magic Bathroom video and get that figured out. Listen to audiobooks in your car or podcasts. You can go over the book again and again, dog ear it, add post-its to mark your pages. I like to index important points in the back of the book and the inside cover. Another real key point is as soon as you wake up, sit down and start studying. Because that's when you're smartest. You build momentum if you start the day that way. Do not waste time with exercise or eating or any of this other stuff first thing in the morning if you want to be a top-notch student. Okay. Afternoon, you can always exercise and you can run your errands and do all that other stuff. No caffeine, no stimulants, no alcohol. I never had coffee until I was an intern in residency, and I was on call a lot, and I was up all night, and I was exhausted. So, yeah, you definitely want coffee or something if you have to drive home after you've been not sleeping, but that was the only time. And then I got stuck on coffee for another 15 years after that, and once I sort of understood it better, I quit because I realized it's bad for me. Okay, never take any stimulants. All these kids that sort of do that stuff, or Adderall, attention deficit, they're all stupid. I never met a real smart person to do that. And like I said, I know the guys who graduated first in the medical school class. I know the ones that were A-plus students at Stanford. I hung around with guys. I know women. I know 3 women personally quite well who graduated second in their medical school class. None of the people, all I know, of all the best students, the best of the best, none of them ever were drinking coffee or taking stimulants. None of this stuff, okay? Coffee came later, and coffee was less common in my generation than it is in the modern generation. The modern generation, because of the internet, I think they pick up bad habits from older people at a faster age. I was sort of oblivious quite often to what somebody, more than 2 years older than me was doing. Okay, always want to get a good night's sleep. There's one memory champion guy said the best vitamin supplement for improved memory was sleep. He called it vitamin S, okay? I never did an all-nighter my whole life. I never even stayed up late for a test. I knew the material. I'm conversant in it. I can articulate everything. I'm going to bed. Okay, exercise builds endurance. Yeah, there's sort of a physical, mental toughness. I think that's partly where good energy comes from, is exercising. Eat low-fat vegan diet. You get better blood flow to the brain. No oils. They mess up blood flow. They cause other ways. They damage brain cells. You want to avoid all those things that processed food with MSG in it. Even organic food can have MSG in it. It's a mild stimulant, so it basically introduces brain noise. Minimize EMF to the extent you can. It, again, adds noise to your brain function. Filter your water, at least a carbon filter. That'll get the estrogenics out. Better yet, reverse osmosis. I've got lectures on water filtration and whatnot. Avoid these other things that are bad for you. Don't do anything with head trauma. Avoid beat music. You can't get smart when you got a bump, bump, bump. You can't. How can you think of anything when there's bump, bump, bump all the time? Don't hold the phone next to your head. Don't put it in your pockets. Make your bedroom an EMF sanctuary. So anyways, these are just a bunch of things that can ramp up your academic performance. And, in my experience, typical students just think you're smarter you're not, and that's completely wrong. You can definitely increase IQ. You can definitely increase cognitive ability, academic ability, and it's pretty easy to do. All these college students, in my opinion, they're kind of a joke. They pay these really expensive tuitions, but they don't know how to study. Why set yourself up for failure? Why not learn how to be good at school, how to memorize stuff well, and do it, and get the most out of your academic class time, and later on be better able to learn quickly on your own.